Welcome to Echoes of WW2, where we explore the real problems America faced in World War II and the solutions that changed history. On the night of December 6, 1941, nothing about Hawaii felt like war. Waikiki was glowing, music drifting through warm air, lights reflecting off the ocean, and young servicemen enjoying what felt like just another carefree weekend. Among them were two U.S. Army Air Force's pilots, Lieutenant Kenneth and Lieutenant George Welch. There was laughter, there was drinking, there was no sense of urgency. Later, the night dissolved into a poker game that stretched well past midnight. The war in Europe felt distant. Japan felt farther still. Like many Americans at the time, Taylor and Welch believed that if the United States were ever attacked, it would come with warnings, diplomatic signals, alerts, orders, not silence. By the time they finally returned to their quarters, it was around 6:30 a.m. Exhausted and still wearing parts of their. At 7:55 a.m., the sound of detonations ripped through the morning air. At first, it was disorienting, too loud, too close. Then came the unmistakable scream of aircraft flying low, followed by machine gun fire. Tanbanome. Outside, black smoke climbed into the sky. Japanese aircraft were already attacking Pearl Harbor. Within minutes, the island was thrown into chaos. Battleships burned at anchor. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Anti-aircraft fire erupted in every direction, often without clear targets. Command systems failed. Communications broke down. American forces, caught completely off guard, struggled to respond. For Taylor and Welch, the most striking detail was what didn't happen. No one gave them orders. There was no coordinated scramble of fighters, no clear instructions. The airfields were devastated, planes neatly lined up and burning. The chain of command, normally rigid and precise, had frozen under the shock of the attack. In that vacuum, the two pilots made a choice. They did not wait to be told what to do. They did not change clothes. They did not ask for permission. Instead, Welch picked up a phone and called Halewa Auxiliary Field, a small overlooked airstrip on Oahu's north shore. Unlike the major bases, Halewa still had two flyable Curtiss P-40B Tomahawks that had survived the initial attack. Taylor grabbed his car, a Buick, and the two men sped across the island, racing past smoke, confusion, and the sound of ongoing explosions. Above them, Japanese planes continued their assault. Below them, America's defenses were still struggling to wake up. It was a moment defined not by planning, but by instinct. Hours earlier, they had been thinking about cards and cocktails. Now, still running on no sleep, they were racing toward the only aircraft that might fight back. What they were about to do would not stop the attack. It would not save Pearl Harbor. But it would become one of the first acts of American resistance in World War II, carried out not by command, not by strategy, but by two pilots who refused to stay on the ground when history arrived without warning. The drive to Halewa was fast, reckless, and silent. Taylor pushed his Buick as hard as the road would allow, swerving around military traffic and civilians fleeing the coastline. Smoke columns marked the sky like beacons. Above them, Japanese aircraft continued to roar overhead, flying so low that their markings were unmistakable. By the time they reached Halewa Auxiliary Field, the reality of the situation became brutally clear. The base was understaffed. There were no standing orders. Ground crews were confused, unsure whether they were even allowed to prepare aircraft. When Taylor and Welch demanded that two Curtiss P-40B Tomahawks be readied for flight, they were told to stand down. The aircraft, they were warned, should be dispersed or abandoned. Welch's response was simple: to hell with that. There was no time for debate. The attack was still underway, and American fighters were not in the air. With no formal authorization, Taylor and Welch climbed into the P-40s. There was no chance to fully arm the planes. Halewa lacked .50 caliber ammunition, so the fighters were loaded only with .30 caliber machine gun rounds, far less than ideal against Japanese bombers. It didn't matter. The engines roared to life and the two aircraft lifted off into a sky already filled with enemy planes. Almost immediately, they spotted a formation of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers returning from their attack runs. Without coordination, without support, Taylor and Welch went straight at them. The encounter was chaotic and violent, short bursts of fire, sudden turns, aircraft flashing past at terrifying speed. They were exhausted, they were outnumbered, they were underarmed, but they were in the fight. Several Japanese aircraft went down under their fire. As their ammunition ran low, the two pilots broke off and headed toward Wheeler Field, the main Army air base on Oahu, hoping to rearm with .50 caliber rounds. Even that was dangerous. As they approached, American anti-aircraft crews, already jittery from the attack, opened fire, mistaking them for enemy planes. Taylor and Welch dodged their own side's flak and landed anyway. On the ground, chaos ruled. Fires burned across the airfield. Ground crews scrambled for cover. Officers argued over whether further flights were even possible. Some tried to order Taylor and Welch out of their cockpits. Again, they refused. Welch's aircraft was rearmed first. As he began to taxi, Japanese dive bombers returned, strafing the airfield. Ground crews scattered, abandoning ammunition boxes on Taylor's wings as they fled. Taylor pushed his throttle forward anyway, bullets spilling off the aircraft as it accelerated down the runway. The two pilots understood the danger instantly. If they tried to climb away, they would be slow, exposed targets. Instead, they did the unthinkable. They charged directly at the incoming Japanese aircraft, engaging them almost immediately after takeoff. It was not a maneuver taught in manuals. It was pure survival. Once again, they fired until they were nearly out of ammunition. Only then did they break off, returning to Halewa to land. As they drove back toward Wheeler, still wearing parts of their tuxedos, they were intercepted by their squadron commander, Major Gordon H. Austin. Seeing their attire and assuming the worst, he shouted, "Get back to Halewa! Don't you know there's a war going on?" Taylor and Welch explained exactly what they had done. Major Austin's tone changed instantly. He thanked them. What Taylor and Welch had done did not turn the tide of the attack. Pearl Harbor burned on. Battleships were lost. The damage was catastrophic. But in the middle of surprise and paralysis, two pilots had shown that America was not completely helpless. The first shots back had been fired, not by order, but by instinct, and history was about to take notice. By the time the smoke began to thin over Oahu, the scale of the disaster at Pearl Harbor was already clear. Battleships lay burning or sunk. Airfields were scarred with wreckage. Hundreds were dead. The attack had achieved its primary objective. But in the official records of the U.S. Army Air Forces, one detail stood out. Two American fighter pilots had gotten airborne, and they had fought back. Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor had not saved Pearl Harbor. No one pretended they had. What they did instead was something quieter, and in some ways more important. They proved that even in total surprise, American resistance was possible. Flying underarmed Curtiss P-40B Tomahawks, they engaged Japanese aircraft at close range. Welch, the more aggressive of the two, pressed his attacks relentlessly, diving into enemy formations whenever he saw an opening. Taylor followed, covering his wingman and taking shots when he could. There was no time to coordinate with other units. No radar guidance, no command direction. Just two pilots reacting to what they saw in the sky. By the end of the morning, U.S. Army Air Force's combat reports credited Welch with 4 confirmed kills and Taylor with 2, a remarkable tally given the circumstances. These were among the only American aerial victories recorded during the attack itself. Equally remarkable was how close the mission came to ending in disaster. The P-40 was fast and rugged, but it was not designed to fight at low altitude against dive bombers in a chaotic airspace filled with friendly flak. Every return to Wheeler Field meant risking being shot down by American anti-aircraft crews. Every takeoff meant climbing into a sky that still belonged to the enemy. Yet Taylor and Welch kept going until there was nothing left to give. Later that day, when the full picture of the attack became known, their actions began to take on symbolic weight. Newspapers and military briefings would soon describe them as pilots who fought back still wearing tuxedos, a detail that captured the suddenness of the war better than any statistic ever could. It was an image Americans understood instantly. One night the country was dancing. The next morning it was at war. The story of Taylor and Welch spread quickly, not because it changed the outcome of December 7th, but because it captured the emotional truth of that day. The United States had been caught unprepared, but not unwilling, shocked, but not paralyzed. For a public struggling to process defeat, that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the U.S. military moved rapidly to turn humiliation into resolve. New air defenses were built, training intensified. The long road to recovery and retaliation began. Within a month, Taylor and Welch were formally recognized for their actions. On January 9, 1942, at Wheeler Army Airfield, both men were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor. The ceremony was brief. The mood was somber. The war had only just begun. Yet the message was clear. Courage did not wait for orders. Resistance did not require preparation. And even in its worst moment, America had fought back. Their story would live on, not as a tale of victory, but as a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can be pulled into extraordinary history. In the days after December 7, 1941, America struggled to understand what had happened. Pearl Harbor was not just a military disaster, it was a psychological shock. The illusion of distance and safety had collapsed overnight. Across the country, anger replaced disbelief, and grief hardened into resolve. The United States was no longer a nation watching the war from afar. It was now fully, irrevocably involved. Against that backdrop, the story of Kenneth Taylor and George Welch took on a life of its own. Their actions were never exaggerated by the military. No one claimed they had turned the tide or saved the fleet. What made their story powerful was its honesty. Two pilots, exhausted and unprepared, had chosen to fight anyway. That choice mattered in a moment when the nation desperately needed proof that it could respond, not just absorb punishment. On January 9, 1942, just over a month after the attack, both men were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross at Wheeler Army Airfield. It was a quiet ceremony, far removed from the drama of December 7th. There was no celebration, only recognition. The war was still young, and the losses were still raw. Taylor and Welch did not become propaganda caricatures. They returned to duty. George Welch went on to become one of the Army Air Force's most skilled pilots. After the war, he became a test pilot, pushing the limits of early jet aircraft at a time when aviation technology was advancing faster than safety could keep up. On October 12, 1954, Welch was killed in a high-speed crash while testing an experimental aircraft. He was only 36 years old. Kenneth Taylor lived a long life. He continued serving his country, carrying the memory of Pearl Harbor not as a symbol, but as a personal experience that never fully faded. Taylor passed away on November 25, 2006, at the age of 96. One of the last living witnesses to the morning America went to war. Their legacy is not measured by medals or kill counts. It is measured by timing. They acted in the narrow space between peace and war, before orders, before strategy, before the machinery of the United States could respond. In that moment, they represented something deeply American: individual responsibility in the absence of authority. The attack on Pearl Harbor exposed unpreparedness, complacency, and failure at the highest levels. But stories like Taylor and Welch's remind us that history is not only shaped by institutions. It is also shaped by individuals who decide, in seconds, how they will respond when the world changes without warning. They did not set out to be heroes. They were tired, out of uniform, and running on instinct. Yet their decision to fight back became one of the earliest symbols of American resistance in World War II. Not because it was planned, not because it was ordered, but because when history arrived at 7:55 a.m., they refused to stay asleep.